Minister, can you tell us a bit about the cases under the ISA today?
Two more Singaporeans have been issued with ROs under the Internal Security Act. For terrorism-related activities, both were self-radicalized online. The trigger was the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict. One is a 14-year-old student. Worryingly, he's the youngest ISA case to date. And it took only a few months for him to be radicalized. He looked online for information on the conflict, and then he began to support Hamas and other militant groups, and he wanted to fight for the Black Flag Army, BFA, and die as a martyr. And he started preparing himself to join the BFA. And he thought if he could not travel to join the BFA, he was willing to attack targets in Singapore on BFA's instructions. And he also thought about attacking non-Muslims in Singapore during festivals like Chinese New Year, Christmas, Deepavali, because he considered them un-Islamic. He also tried to radicalize some of his schoolmates, but was unsuccessful. ISD intervened early before he could go further. The second is Anadia Anad. She is 33 years old. She is the second person issued with an order now. She's a former public servant. She was also triggered by the Israel-Hamas conflict. Anadia had come to attention before. And during the latest conflict, she came across a group called the Axis of Resistance, AOR. She began to support AOR. She supported the attacks against Israel and Israel's allies, including civilians. She also advocated for violence. She was the administrator of a social media channel, and the channel glorified AOR's military operations. She was not successful in getting her family and friends to join the channel. And Anadia was aware that her online activities were unlawful, not acceptable for a public servant, so she hid her extremist views and activities from her colleagues. Her support for AOR's violence, her spreading of propaganda to promote their cause, was a cause for concern and a security risk. So restriction orders under ISA have been issued against both. No detention. The restriction orders mean that they cannot engage in some activities. I would say ISD has done excellent work.
Can you tell us how overseas conflicts have affected the threats that we face in Singapore?
You can see the two cases show that overseas conflicts can affect us internally. You can also see the risk of extremist narratives. They threaten our own national security and social harmony. Singaporeans are deeply concerned about the situation in Gaza, and rightly so. It is a serious situation. Thousands of innocent lives lost. It's a massive humanitarian crisis affecting the Palestinians, and many of us sympathize with the Palestinian cause. I sympathize with the Palestinian cause. They should have their own country and not suffer like this. And you have seen the government's position on the Gaza crisis and Singapore's recent vote at the UN on Palestinian statehood. But sympathy for any foreign cause cannot mean we can support or allow terrorism. Action was taken against a young boy and Anadia, not because they supported Palestine. As I said, many of us are deeply affected by the plight of Palestinians, and we show our support in concrete ways. We have organized fundraising, sending of humanitarian aid, and Singapore has taken a clear position internationally in international organizations. But action was taken against the two of them because of their support for armed violence. And in the case of the young boy, because also that he was prepared to engage in armed violence himself.
And can you tell us what are we doing about self-radicalization, especially with the individuals getting younger?
We have to, I think, continue to deal with self-radicalization in Singapore, like many other places in the world. Those radicalized are getting younger. This is a global trend. We have seen several cases around the world of armed violence by self-radicalized young people. Recently in Sydney, in London, you've seen young boys being picked up. In Singapore, 40 self-radicalized Singaporeans have been dealt with under the ISA since 2015, and 13 were aged 20 or under, so you can see for yourself. ISD will continue to work with community partners. We try and intensify our outreach efforts to counter youth radicalization. So anyone, regardless of age, gender, religion, or profession, can be radicalized. And both these cases involve individuals with different profiles. One was a young boy, student. The other was an adult who should have been more aware of the dangers of radicalization. Yet she was also vulnerable. So an ISD will take action against anyone in Singapore who supports, promotes, or makes preparations to take up armed violence, regardless of how they rationalize that violence and regardless of where the violence takes place.
Sir, career prompts a lot here. Can we find out why did ISD decide to issue restriction orders instead of taking them into custody?
Under the Internal Security Act, ISD can, decide, recommend to the minister, myself, detention orders or series of restriction orders which can impose restrictions on you, for example, about changing your residence, traveling overseas, other things. And these powers of detention, other powers, obviously have to be exercised responsibly. And that means that you need to look at the cases individually and calibrate the orders imposed in a way that deals with your assessment of the threat. So you shouldn't be detaining if your assessment is there's no necessity for detention. If something lower, a restriction order would be enough. So these two were, to give an analogy, they were on a travelator that was traveling in one direction. ISD will have to assess how close they were to the destination, how serious and how imminent the threat was. And their assessment was the restriction orders imposed were enough to get them to get off the travelator for the time being. What were the orders that imposed? Broadly, they cannot travel overseas. Makes sense. They cannot change their residence without letting ISD know. They cannot access, there are some restrictions on how they access social media, obviously. So you can see that, we try and let them get on with their lives as far as possible, but at the same time try and move them away from the path of radicalization, and hopefully the families will step in and help them, and friends too. But we have had cases in the past where ISD would take a limited step, restriction order, and then after a while it doesn't work and the person goes back to his activities and becomes more of a threat, and further orders have been issued.